to this introduction to National Integrated Planning and Reporting, or as I prefer to call it, how Australians can rise above politics and set the agenda for the nation's future. I'm Bronwyn Kelly, the founder of Australian Community Futures Planning, or ACFP. We're a new organisation doing something very new. Our purpose is to give Australians an efficient means by which they can take more control of their future and build the sort of country they want to leave to future generations. And the means that we are offering for this purpose is a new but simple process, a community engagement and long-term planning process that we've called National Integrated Planning and Reporting, or National IP&R. It's something very practical that we can add quite easily into our existing processes of democracy and elections to make them work better for us, for everyone, for we, the people. This is something that any and every Australian can participate in. It's long-term planning driven by Australians. ACFP is already using National Integrated Planning and Reporting to help Australians build our first ever National Community Futures Plan. That plan is called Australia Together, and you can find the starting drafts of it on the ACFP website at www.austcfp.com.au. You'll find the address in the description below. On the website you can also find out more information about how Australia Together is being built by using National Integrated Planning and Reporting. ACFP is a centre of excellence in national IP&R. In 2021, we're the only developer and practitioner of this new process within the democracy at the national level. But over the next decade, we will be working to make it a widely understood and used mechanism for strengthening Australia as a democratic nation. Something that should be taught in schools and unis, and something that should be supported by federal, state and local governments. If we succeed in that, Australians will have something they can use to turbocharge their progress towards their preferred future. Something that can make politicians listen to them and be much better leaders. To kickstart that, we've devised this series explaining National IP&R. In this part, episode 1, I'll cover the purpose of National IP&R, what's prompted it, and what it's been designed to achieve. What's prompted it is our sense that political leaders are failing us. What it's been designed to achieve is a more powerful voice for Australians in their democracy, just when they need it most. In subsequent episodes, I'll set out how National IP&R works in practice. I'll explain the opportunities it offers, particularly insofar as it can help us re-establish trust in our political system and leaders. And I'll provide some examples of the sort of ideas that can come from National Integrated Planning, ideas that can speed us safely towards an acceptable degree of well-being and security by 2050 or sooner. But for now, let's get started on the purpose of National IP&R. What's prompted it? Why now? National Integrated Planning and Reporting is new, and at first glance it will look strange. It will look like a piece of jargon, the time-wasting plaything maybe of bureaucrats. But National IP&R is really just a way of bringing people together into a well-ordered and well-informed public open space so that they can work out how they want to travel safely to their preferred future. It provides us with an open and orderly process to build a well-integrated long-term plan for our society, our environment, our economy, and our democracy. ACFP has called the plan that can come out of this process Australia Together, because it's to be built by Australians using National IP&R. The idea is simply that if we act together, we can work out how to put the pieces of that plan together. We're assembling the best strategies, those most suited to our long-term aims, not just the short-term aims. And we're integrating our strategies to accelerate our progress towards our preferred future, a future we have described in a draft vision and direction statements and can revise as we see fit. Later in this series, I'll talk about where that draft vision comes from. It comes from what Australians have already told researchers that they want for the future on the few occasions they've been asked over the decade to 2020. But for now, I'll just say that with the aid of this draft vision statement and National IP&R, Australians can assemble and integrate the best strategies capable of delivering safety, security and well-being for everyone. The integration is what makes this plan more powerful than anything that has been designed for our future before. Initially, it will probably be incomprehensible that we can organise ourselves as a mass of people across this vast country to build a long-term plan for a whole nation, and to foresee what will be necessary in strategies to maximise our chances of making that future nation a reality. It will seem particularly odd as a suggestion, given that those of us used to living in the successful democracy that Australia has been will assume it's the job of elected political leaders to set the direction of the country and take us there. Why else do we pay them? It's a mystery as to why we would assume that they will take us safely to where we want to go if we actually haven't told the politicians where we want to go, which we haven't, not in a coherent manner anyway. But even if we had told them, the reality is that when it comes to whether we can secure our future, many Australians are now quite justifiably disenchanted with politics, with the integrity and commitment of many of our current politicians, and with the capacity of our elected leaders to deliver. At least, that's what the latest surveys of the opinions of Australians in 2021 would suggest. For instance, Next 25 is a group of independent researchers who, in late 2020, conducted a survey of over 3,000 Australians to build a picture of how well we think the public interest and our future security are being served by our current political systems and leaders. They reported in early 2021 that the public interest, short or long term, wasn't being served very well at all. Only 27% of respondents said governments put the public before vested interests. Only 34% said government is taking future generations into account. Only 39% were confident Australia will be a better country in 5 to 10 years. Only 30% felt we could influence the future. And only 34% believe they have a say beyond voting. This quite pessimistic poll about our values and opinions on the health and strength of our democracy was taken during the COVID-19 pandemic. Several other polls taken around the same time show that our confidence in governments rose a little higher than this rather bleak assessment during the first year of the pandemic on some fronts. For instance, the Edelman Trust Barometer, an annual global survey of trust in the institutions of government, non-government organisations, business and the media, revealed a big leap off a very low base in our trust in all those institutions in 2021, albeit that the rise in our trust wasn't quite big enough to restore our classification as a trusting nation according to the Edelman Barometer. Trust in Australians' institutions in the early 2020s is still somewhat fragile. These institutions disappoint us. And what's more disturbing is that while what the Edelman researchers called the informed public reported that they trusted our institutions, the mass population still reported that it trusted no institutions, indicating a nation divided in its confidence about what can and can't be trusted. Nevertheless, based on this survey and some others, it seems that in 2020, Australians moved into a period of increased appreciation of any cooperative actions of state and federal governments, insofar as they could improve our ability to deal with a crisis in the present, COVID-19. And on this basis, our confidence increased, at least temporarily. But there's little, if any, evidence that confidence rose about the resilience of the nation and the trustworthiness of our governments to deal with future challenges. particularly those arising from climate change. The ABC's giant-sized Australia Talks 2021 survey of 60,000 Australians, for instance, showed that 63% of us rated climate change as a big problem, but sadly, 68% of us thought Australia was doing poorly at addressing it. Likewise, the Lowy Institute poll in 2021 found that 61% of Australians thought climate change would pose a critical threat to our interests in the next decade, but we gave the federal government a very poor score on its management of climate change. We gave it 4.6 out of 10, the worst score for any of the priority reform areas we identified. Climate change, biggest challenge, worst level of readiness. Australians know that climate change dwarfs the pandemic as a national challenge, and they know our current strategies and plans aren't up to it. There is some evidence in the Australia Talk survey suggesting that since the onset of the pandemic, more Australians are optimistic about the country's future than before the pandemic. But even so, there's no evidence that we really believe we have things in hand, that we have sufficient resilience and are prepared for future shocks. Underneath the optimism, at the back of our minds, we're worried for future generations. In the same ABC survey, for instance, when we were asked to think about the future beyond COVID-19, 59% of Australians agreed that the future looks tough for younger people. In every age group, more Australians agree than disagree that things will be tougher for the young. About 3 in 4 Australians aged between 18 and 29, that's 75%, think they'll have it tougher than their parents. And without significant policy changes in Australia, they certainly will. And while the pandemic seems to have made a few more of us optimistic about the future of Australia, at least temporarily, it hasn't made much difference to our optimism about the future of the world. Post-pandemic, a third of us have retained an optimistic world view, but on the whole, we still don't think things look rosy on a global scale, and we have many reasons to be concerned that global economic change will intrude on us. Overall, these results indicate that when Australians think about how the pandemic has affected us, we feel comforted by our comparative geographic isolation, and some of us maybe even assume that we can cut ourselves off from the world, perhaps forever, needing less or perhaps no international trade, either in imports or exports. The Next 25 Navigator survey seems to indicate that many of us now aspire to Australia becoming self-sufficient, perhaps even so self-sufficient that we need not deal with other nations in the globalised economy. The question that prompted this response in the Next 25 poll implied that it's feasible to attain economic security or growth without trade or with less of it. And our answers might imply that we assume we'll be able to reduce or perhaps even cease imports and still expect that the world will buy our exports at prices we prefer. Who knows what respondents thought or meant when they were asked about this aspiration of self-sufficiency. What does seem clear, though, is that in post-COVID Australia, there is a sense that some of us may be considering the possibility that we need no longer take a place on the international stage or participate in negotiations to share the future and world economic growth fairly with other nations. If so, that would amount to a character change for Australia, a preferred retreat into isolationism and a move away from some things that have been remarkable contributors to Australia's post-war successes, most notably multiculturalism and global cooperation. This sort of retreat would be a natural reaction to something as threatening as COVID-19, and there is no doubt that increased self-sufficiency makes sense, up to a point. Obviously, there are certain areas of our economy where we could benefit from being less reliant on other nations. Vaccines come to mind. But on the other hand, there's that climate change worry hanging over us, and the real sense when we answer other types of questions that there are some ways in which we can't assume that the isolationism many have enjoyed during the pandemic can be permanent and will save us. When it comes to climate, borders don't save us, because climate doesn't recognise borders. It's the one issue that indicates more than any other the need to move forward with the rest of the world, not without it. So it's particularly unfortunate that climate change, according to both the Lowy poll and the ABC Australia Talks poll, is the area where we feel politicians are failing us the most. And the failure, the gap between our expectations in the early 2020s and the government's response, is a spectacular gap that politicians of all persuasions might be well advised to attend to. According to the Australia Institute's Climate of the Nation survey in 2020, 82% of Australians are concerned that climate change will result in more bushfires. 83% support a phase-out of coal-fired power stations. 71% think Australia should be a world leader in finding solutions to climate change. 65% think the Australian government should stop new coal mines. 74% believe government should plan to phase out existing coal mining and transition to other industries. 65% support the introduction of a levy on Australia's fossil fuel exports to help pay for climate disasters. 72% believe mining companies should be liable for any land or water contamination caused by fracking. 59% would prefer Australia's economic recovery to be primarily powered by renewables, compared to only 12% who prefer it to be powered by gas, and 68% support a national target for net zero carbon emissions by 2050. The federal coalition government in 2021 is failing us on every single one of these, and the policies of the Labor opposition also fall short on several critical expectations. It's clear that there's no leadership coming from politicians in the major parties on the very issue that most Australians feel is the biggest threat to our well-being and prosperity. This leadership gap is what National IP&R is designed to fill, not just on climate change, but on all areas where Australians feel they are being let down by their leaders and institutions. It's designed to help us create a new relationship with elected leaders, one where we have more influence than we do now, because we have a means of acting and speaking together in an orderly planning and reporting framework, a place where the voice of the people counts for more. National IP&R is a game changer in the way power is shared in democracy. It can help us all get above base politics. In the next part of this episode, I'll move on to how National IP&R can give Australians a more powerful voice in their own democracy. Australian Community Futures Planning recognises that National IP&R comes rather out of the blue, and that many people will naturally be incredulous about its potential as a game changer in how power is shared between leaders and we the people. But it only requires a small shift in the way we imagine how power relationships can work in a democracy. They don't have to work the way they do now. They don't have to be set up so that they disempower both current and future generations, both today's voters and tomorrow's. A good place to start talking about how power relationships can be reset is to ask people to imagine what life could be like if we and our leaders could get above politics. Imagine for a moment an Australia where we don't have to choose from the impoverished policy menus offered to us by political parties, and where instead we can insist they choose from our menus. Imagine a relationship with our politicians where we aren't confined to choices from the narrow, short-sighted, essentially self-serving party political platforms that are usually dished up at election time. These menus are presented to Australians with a tacit appended message of like it or lump it. And as the voting generally goes, about 50% of us get to like what's on the menu for the next 3 years, and the other 50% have to lump it. That's quite a lot of dissatisfied voters, at least for the short term. But what is even more dissatisfying is that in this arrangement, 100% of us are almost always required to choose to like or lump the short-term offer at the complete expense of our long-term preferences and prospects. For instance, we're offered tax cuts, but we're not told about the long-term cost, which is a loss of services. We are asked to shortchange ourselves, and because nothing else is on offer, we do. That arrangement thereby degrades both politicians and we the people, and there's no reason why any of us need settle for that. The arrangement prevents us from becoming what we otherwise would wish to be, a cohesive, energised, outward-looking and forward-looking nation of happy and healthy people. And while we're imagining this possible reset of our current power arrangements, let's imagine how much more efficiently everything could run if we the people set our preferred longer-term agenda first and then simply assess the political candidates on their commitment to that agenda, their integrity and their demonstrated competence. Imagine how quickly we could get started after each election on vital reforms that are in everyone's interest and on programs to build resilience against future shocks like pandemics, natural disasters, economic recessions and wars. Instead of waiting decades for progress on key issues like climate change, we could start decades earlier. No more messy, vacuous, partisan arguments. No more waiting around in the hope that political parties will agree on something and get going. Instead, we could tell them what to do and they could truly become the servants of the people that many of them claim to be, but so seldom are. Pie in the sky, perhaps? Idealistic, perhaps? Nevertheless, it's a very practical and entirely feasible possibility. If we discard the paradigm that assumes politics is the sole stage on which progress can occur, admitting that of late at least nothing in the way of progress has arisen from politics, then this imagined possibility is not pie in the sky at all. It's the very idealism we need. We just have to organise it. After all, this is the internet age, not the Middle Ages. And in this new age of open information and skill sharing, educated societies like Australia have far greater capacity to get organised in the way they compose and integrate their ideas for the future and their preferences for the safe paths towards it. As a result, we have an unprecedented opportunity to set the agenda ourselves and lay it down for politicians. We can plan first, then vote. We can move well beyond the power relationships that have obtained since the formation of political parties back in the horse and buggy days. Up until now, we haven't had the means to get our act together and set out a coherent plan to secure an acceptable degree of well-being and security in the future. Indeed, planning is unfashionable, if only because some leaders who might have tried it in the past have often spectacularly failed the people. Think of Stalin. On the other hand, some have succeeded. Think of Roosevelt, or our own John Curtin, who succeeded in post-World War II reconstruction by setting out a plan for it years ahead of the end of the war. Either way, the internet and our degree of education give us the means of building far better plans for the nation than we've ever been able to build before. More than that, the internet gives us the possibility of doing it together, if only because it gives us ways to connect with people we otherwise could never have communicated with in such a vast country. What the internet doesn't do, because it isn't properly set up yet, is give us the possibility of building better plans efficiently. That opportunity for efficiency in our policy development and planning is vital for two reasons. It's vital because we are running severely short of time to conquer challenges like climate change, and it's vital because we busy Australians, the time poor, won't be able to rise above politics and the short-term agendas unless there is an efficient space in which we can increase participation in our own democracy for longer-term aims. The internet doesn't come to us already well organised for coherent planning in the national interest. That space has to be made on the internet. And a process to help us integrate all the best strategies efficiently in that space has to be invented. As it so happens, it has been invented. It's called National Integrated Planning and Reporting. And it's a discovery that presents us with significant new opportunities. National IP&R makes it easy for the first time to assemble and follow comprehensive, readily understood long-term plans, and this can set us up to be able to relate to politicians in a far more productive and less combative way. We've never thought of running things this way because we haven't had a way to organise our strategies. But in 2021 we certainly can. The fact is that because, courtesy of the internet, so much information is open source these days and is no longer the preserve of academics and high-level public servants, we already know what to do for the vast majority of our problems, like pandemics and economic recessions. But in addition to this, we also know how to head off the majority of the risk we can foresee, like climate change and wars. We just have to assemble that knowledge in an open, live planning space using an orderly and inclusive community engagement process. That's what National IP&R offers, an inclusive process where Australians can interact and assemble their preferred menu. ACFP has been set up to help Australians use that process within their democracy. If we want to shift to this idea of getting our politicians to choose from our menus so that it's not just an idea stuck in the realm of imagination, the first thing we have to do is to start composing our menu. If we want to increase our influence with political leaders and the weight of our voice, if we want them not just to listen but to actually hear us, we have to be saying something worth hearing, and something less muddled, something well ordered and comprehensible, so that they can't miss what we're saying or ignore us as much as they have been, or quite as easily divide us against each other. With all that we have at our disposal today, so much education, information and communication, we're no longer necessarily confined to just dreaming about what life could be like if we had our choice and if we had better leaders. We can plot a practical course toward that life together, finding a place for everyone's safety, security and well-being. National Integrated Planning and Reporting is new, but it's there. It's uniquely suited to this purpose, and the time to use it is now. Why wait? In the second episode in this series, I'll set out the mechanics of National IP&R and show how it works to support us in building long-term plans for our entire society, environment, economy and democracy. I'll show how we can give our politicians and institutions a much-needed helping hand, one that can only come from us, from we, the people. Thanks for watching this episode. If you like this program, please click like on the YouTube page and share the program with your friends and subscribe to this channel.